Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to ancient Rome, back to marble corridors echoing with footsteps, the faint smell of wine and incense, and the constant anxiety of wondering whether your employer might feed you to wild animals before breakfast. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let the world outside fade away for a while. Because tonight's story isn't about the glories of Rome or its legions marching across the world. It's about the people trapped inside those marble walls, the invisible hands who made the empire function, and sometimes, who paid the price for existing in the same building as someone named Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Most people just call him Caligula. A name that, depending on who you ask, either means little boot or the man who turned imperial power into a fever dream. And if you worked for him, especially as a slave, well, it didn't go great. The emperor who should have stayed a mascot. Let's start where most terrible reigns begin: childhood trauma and unchecked power. Caligula was born into the imperial family, the son of Germanicus, a popular general, and Agrippina the Elder, who was more or less a professional survivor in the snake pit that was Julio Claudian politics. When Caligula was little, he used to tag along with his father's army. The soldiers adored him because he wore a tiny uniform and boots like theirs. They called him Caligula, which roughly translates to little boots. It was cute. And that's usually where the story of adorable nicknames should end. But Roman history had other plans. Because that same child, once grown, would become one of the most feared and erratic emperors Rome ever produced, a man who allegedly declared war on the sea, demanded divine worship from his dinner guests, and thought of human life as background decoration. For most Romans, Caligula was terrifying. But for his slaves, attendants, and household staff, he was a daily existential crisis. Life inside the palace. Now, imagine you're a palace slave under Caligula. On the surface, you're living in luxury. Marble floors. Perfumed halls. Access to the emperor himself. But beneath all that? Constant fear. The palace wasn't just a workplace. It was a pressure cooker, hundreds of servants, cooks, scribes, and musicians all trying to anticipate Caligula's moods before he even knew what they were. And that was no easy task. Because Caligula's moods changed faster than a Roman senator's loyalty. He could go from weeping with joy at a play to ordering an actor's execution for performing too well. He could dine lavishly with his household one evening, and by dawn, have half the staff replaced, or worse, simply to make a point. One historian, Suetonius, described him as a man who treated cruelty like an art form. He once said, "I wish the Roman people had but one neck." To a normal person, that's a disturbing thing to say. To Caligula, it was. Monday. The rules were simple: there were no rules. Working for him meant never knowing what counted as an offense. Smile at the wrong time? Death. Fail to laugh at one of his jokes? Death. Laugh too much? Still death. In Caligula's palace, you could die for not worshipping him enough, or for worshipping him too enthusiastically. He reportedly liked to test loyalty with psychological games. For instance, he'd invite someone to dinner, tell them how much he admired their devotion, then suddenly burst out laughing. When they nervously asked what was funny, he'd reply, "Oh, I was just thinking how easily I could have you killed right now." Classic dinner banter. Now, imagine being the slave serving wine during that exchange. Your job is to keep your hand steady, refill the goblet, and pretend none of this is horrifying. Because flinching could get you killed. So could spilling wine. Or existing too close to the emperor when he was bored. The entertainment industry, Caligula edition. Caligula loved theater and spectacle, but not in the way most people do. He didn't just watch performances, he participated. And often, his household slaves were part of the cast, whether they wanted to be or not. He'd order musicians to play for hours while he danced on stage dressed as a god. If someone in the audience yawned, or looked tired, he'd point them out and have them beaten. At one point, he even turned his palace into a literal stage. The dining halls, courtyards, and gardens became backdrops for whatever theatrical whim struck him that day. He'd reenact myths, staging elaborate scenes where servants played gods, nymphs, and monsters. The endings were never happy, because Caligula. There's one account that he had slaves thrown into the sea during mock naval battles simply because he thought it looked more realistic. The line between performance and punishment blurred constantly. And if you were part of his staff, you were always one command away from becoming part of the show. Meals, madness, and money. Let's drift over to the imperial banquets. Romans loved a good dinner party. But Caligula's banquets were on another level, equal parts opulent and unhinged. He once served solid gold loaves of bread to prove he could. Another time, he replaced traditional dishes with piles of jewels, because that's what happens when you run out of new ways to show off. The food wasn't just for eating, it was for humiliation. Slaves might be forced to serve naked, or wear elaborate costumes just to make their emperor laugh. And then there were the random acts of generosity, what historians call Caligula's dangerous kindness. He'd sometimes hand out fortunes to his attendants or shower slaves with gold. Which sounds nice, until you realize that accepting those gifts could make other courtiers jealous, and jealousy was basically a death sentence in that palace. One day you're Caligula's favorite musician. The next, someone whispers that your melody reminded the emperor of his dead sister, and suddenly, you're gone. Speaking of sisters, Caligula's relationship with his sisters deserves its own whispery moment. He adored them, especially Drusilla. Too much, according to some sources. When she died, he declared her a goddess, turned the empire into a temple for her memory, and spent days weeping dramatically in public. He even made people swear oaths by her name, as if she were divine. For his palace slaves, this meant memorizing yet another set of rituals, gestures, and taboos, all revolving around a woman who was now worshipped posthumously. You had to bow at her image. Never speak of her without reverence. And heaven help you if you dropped one of her ceremonial candles. It was emotional theater at an imperial scale, and the staff were its unwilling stagehands. Sleep was optional. Even rest was uncertain. Caligula had a habit of summoning people at odd hours, senators, soldiers, attendants, slaves, anyone he felt like talking to. Sometimes he'd want to discuss philosophy. Sometimes, his horse. He was particularly fond of his horse, Incitatus, who had his own marble stable, jeweled collar, and servants. The horse ate oats mixed with gold flakes, which probably gave every nearby slave an ulcer just watching. Caligula once planned to make the horse a consul. And whether he was serious or not, the people around him had to pretend it was a brilliant idea. Imagine being the scribe who had to draft that decree. You'd sit there at your wax tablet thinking, sure, why not, horse consul 41 AD sounds about right. And then, you'd try very hard not to laugh. Fear is a management strategy. The palace ran on fear and spectacle. Caligula loved reminding everyone that he held absolute power, life, death, and everything in between. He'd have prisoners executed during dinner parties, just to keep things lively. He ordered nobles to kiss his feet, crawl across the floor, or watch their friends die as entertainment. And all the while, the slaves were there, refilling cups, fanning the air, trying not to breathe too loudly. One account claims he once lined up a group of attendants and asked which of them wanted to die first. No one answered. So he picked one at random. It was a warning to the rest, don't hesitate when Caligula asks you anything. The breaking point. Eventually, even the palace couldn't take it anymore. The guards, the courtiers, the administrators, they'd all seen too much. The whisper networks grew louder. Plots began to form in corners and corridors. And in 41 AD, Caligula's own bodyguard, along with members of the Praetorian Guard, decided enough was enough. They killed him in a hallway after one of his plays, ironic, since he always did love a dramatic ending. When the news spread, the palace erupted, not in mourning, but in quiet relief. For the slaves, it must have felt like waking from a nightmare. Though of course, freedom wasn't on the horizon, they just traded one master for another. Still, for a brief moment, they could breathe without wondering whether laughter or silence would get them killed. The echo left behind. Caligula's name became synonymous with madness and tyranny. But it's worth remembering that behind every tyrant, there are hundreds of people trapped in their shadow. The cooks who prepared impossible feasts. The scribes who wrote meaningless decrees. The slaves who carried lamps through corridors at midnight, never knowing if the next step would be their last. History remembers Caligula as a monster. But for the people inside his palace, he was simply Tuesday. Soft pause. And as we drift onward tonight, let's leave Rome's marble halls behind. Let's move from the cruelty of an emperor to another kind of royal absurdity, one gilded in lace and powdered sugar, centuries later. Next, we'll drift toward Versailles, where kings built entire mirrors just to look at themselves. Hey everyone. Welcome back. If you're still awake after Caligula's midnight chaos, congratulations. If not, don't worry, that's sort of the point. Tonight, we're gliding a few thousand years forward. From Rome's marble cruelty to France's golden absurdity. From emperors who screamed at their slaves, to kings who spent 3 hours deciding which shoes to wear. So go ahead, settle in, maybe shift the blanket a bit. Because tonight we're visiting Versailles, the glittering dream of absolute monarchy, where everyone looked perfect, smelled terrible, and occasionally fainted from wearing too much lace. The palace that ate France. Versailles wasn't built to be lived in. It was built to be admired, preferably from a safe distance. When Louis XIV decided to move his entire court there, it wasn't because it was comfortable. It was because it was controllable. The Sun King didn't just want to rule France. He wanted to choreograph it. So he built Versailles like a stage. Every hallway, garden, and fountain had a role to play. Even the ceilings told stories, usually about how magnificent Louis was. And his courtiers? They were the props. Mornings with the Sun King. Let's start with the mornings, or what the French called le lever du roi, the king's waking ceremony. For most people, waking up involves a bit of groaning and trying to remember what day it is. For Louis XIV, it involved about 100 people. There was an entire schedule for who could enter the room first, who could hand him his shirt, who could tie the ribbons on his sleeves, and who could pretend not to notice that the King of France was still half asleep. Some nobles waited years, for the privilege of holding the royal sock. If you were lower on the hierarchy, you didn't get to touch anything. You just stood quietly in the corner, bowing at regular intervals, as though the mere act of witnessing the king's morning stretch was a divine blessing. It was theater disguised as politics. And for Louis, it worked. While everyone else was busy jockeying for the honor of watching him put on pants, he remained firmly in control. The smell of royalty. Now, about Versailles, it was beautiful. From a distance. Up close, it smelled like civilization's dirty secret. There was no proper plumbing. Chamber pots overflowed. Perfume replaced soap. The gardens were grand, but the hallways were full of rotten sweat, because thousands of courtiers lived on site and rarely left. The poor palace staff, servants, valets, chambermaids, were in constant motion, scrubbing, sweeping, and pretending the stench of fermented wigs was perfectly normal. Visitors described Versailles as dazzling, suffocating, and strangely damp, like a perfumed swamp made of gold leaf. But for those who lived there, it was paradise, or so they told themselves. Nobles in captivity. You see, Versailles wasn't just a palace. It was a gilded trap. Louis XIV's great genius was realizing that if he kept his nobles busy with gossip, ceremonies, and fashion rivalries, they wouldn't have time to start rebellions. So he invited them all to live with him. Or rather, to orbit him, like perfume-scented moons revolving around the sun. To keep your place, you had to attend every ritual, every meal, every concert. Miss one bow, one glance, one whispered compliment, and you risked fading from the king's favor. Imagine living in a world where your career depended on how gracefully you handed someone a napkin. That was Versailles. And people loved it. They competed to outdress each other, outflatter each other, outspend each other, even if it meant going bankrupt in the process. The phrase "keeping up appearances" wasn't a saying there. It was a survival strategy. Fashion victims, literally. Let's drift to fashion, because Versailles practically invented the concept of overdressing. Men wore heels higher than most women's today, powdered wigs so heavy they could cause headaches, and coats so stiff they could stand up on their own. Women had it worse. Corsets so tight they could faint, skirts so wide they couldn't fit through doors, and hairstyles that sometimes required scaffolding. One duchess reportedly had a miniature ship built into her hair to celebrate a naval victory. It was majestic until the candles caught it on fire. There were entire servants whose only job was to carry the noblewoman's skirt or fix her wig if gravity failed. Which it often did. But again, no one complained. Because fashion at Versailles wasn't just vanity. It was currency. The more elaborate your outfit, the closer you appeared to the king's light. And everyone wanted to shine, even if it meant suffocating in velvet. Dining with divinity. Meals were another ritual of control. Louis XIV didn't eat alone. He dined in public, under chandeliers, surrounded by courtiers who stood silently and watched him chew. It was called the Grand Couvert, the Great Meal. The courtiers didn't join in. They simply observed, as if witnessing a sacred rite. If you were lucky, you might be invited to stand closer. If you were very lucky, you could hand him a napkin. If you were too lucky, you'd get promoted to silverware duty, which meant you spent dinner terrified of dropping a spoon. The irony? Louis himself wasn't exactly elegant. He ate enormous portions, often dripping sauce down his chin, while everyone pretended it was the most graceful thing they'd ever seen. Because pretending was the cornerstone of Versailles. The gossip economy. Nothing at court mattered more than gossip. It was the bloodstream of Versailles, a whisper network made of silk and suspicion. Who looked at whom during the ball? Who wore the wrong color? Who was falling out of favor? Entire careers were built on knowing who sneezed in front of the king that morning. The servants played a crucial role in this ecosystem. They saw everything. And while they were officially invisible, their information could be traded for favors, money, or protection. A chambermaid's rumor could make or break a duke. A valet's silence could be worth a fortune. Versailles ran on gold leaf and gossip. And both were equally fake. The endless spectacle. Louis XIV wasn't content to rule, he wanted to perform kingship. Every day at Versailles was a show. There were ballets, concerts, hunts, fireworks, feasts. He even performed in plays himself, often as Apollo, the sun god, because of course he did. The courtiers clapped like their lives depended on it. Which, in a sense, they did. One nobleman once wrote, "At Versailles, you learn to smile while dying of boredom." That could have been the palace motto. Even the gardens were designed like choreography, fountains that sprayed at just the right moment when the king passed, paths aligned perfectly with the sun. It was beautiful, controlled, and entirely hollow. The cost of grandeur. Behind the gold walls, Versailles was eating France alive. The palace consumed unimaginable wealth, forests for its beams, villages for its stone, taxes for its fountains. Ordinary people were starving. But inside, the music never stopped. When Louis XIV died in 1715, the state was drowning in debt. His successor, Louis XV, inherited a sparkling prison that no one could afford to maintain. Yet the courtiers kept playing the same game, pretending the world outside didn't exist. By the time Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette came along, the illusion had cracked, but no one dared look away. They just built bigger wigs and hoped for the best. Spoiler, the best did not happen. Versailles after dark. At night, Versailles was strangely quiet. The halls, once full of chatter and music, echoed with the faint sounds of footsteps, servants extinguishing candles, courtiers sneaking into the wrong bedrooms, the rustle of silk in the dark. By candlelight, all the gold faded into shadow. And for a moment, the palace looked less like a dream, and more like what it really was, a fragile world built on fear and pretense. For the servants who worked there, it must have been a haunting sight. You could polish mirrors all day, but never see yourself reflected in them. The Sun King had set, but his shadow lingered for generations. The sleep of kings. Louis XIV believed that by controlling every movement, every breath of his court, he could create eternal order. He didn't. He just built the world's most expensive bedtime story. A glittering illusion that, like all illusions, eventually faded. But even centuries later, Versailles still whispers. Not in the language of power, but of vanity, the quiet sound of 1,000 people pretending to love a man made of sunlight. Soft pause. So, as you drift tonight, imagine the sound of those corridors. The faint echo of heels on marble. Perfume and powder floating in the dark. And somewhere, the ghosts of courtiers still curtsying in their sleep. Because at Versailles, appearances were everything. Even in dreams. And now, let's drift onward again, to another royal disaster. One that traded lace for velvet, wigs for wigs, and manners for madness. Next, we'll visit the Tudors, and explore why being part of that family was an excellent way to lose your head, literally and otherwise. Hey everyone! Welcome back. If you've made it this far, you've survived both Caligula's palace and Versailles without losing your mind, or your wig. That's an achievement. Tonight, we're drifting into a dynasty that truly believed drama was hereditary. The Tudors. A family so spectacularly dysfunctional that Shakespeare could have written their family dinners as tragedies, and probably did, accidentally. So, tuck in, get comfortable, and imagine the flicker of candlelight over a velvet throne, because this is the story of a royal bloodline that should have just taken a collective nap instead of ruling England. A royal house built on luck and nerves. The Tudors weren't supposed to exist. They kind of snuck onto the throne. Henry VII, the founder, won the crown by accident, or, more precisely, by winning one particularly chaotic battle and marrying the right woman afterward. He wasn't a romantic. He was practical, nervous, and slightly paranoid, because he had every reason to be. Half of England wanted him dead. The other half just hadn't decided yet. He spent most of his reign hiding his money in literal boxes and counting it at night like a royal goblin. But his greatest achievement was starting a dynasty that was doomed to implode within 3 generations. Because while Henry VII was cautious, his son Henry VIII was not. Henry VIII, the man who couldn't stop marrying people. You know him. Everyone does. The king with 6 wives, a temper problem, and a waistline that expanded in proportion to his ego. Henry VIII began his reign as a handsome, athletic prince, charming, musical, poetic. By the end, he looked like a roast ham with a crown. But let's start at the beginning, when he was still idealistic, or at least pretending to be. Catherine of Aragon, the original wife. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was a Spanish princess, beautiful, educated, and patient in ways that should qualify her for sainthood. She was also his brother's widow, which made their marriage slightly awkward but politically convenient. For years, things were fine. Then Catherine failed to produce a surviving male heir. This, in Henry's mind, was not a matter of biology, but betrayal. He convinced himself that his lack of sons was God's punishment for marrying his brother's widow. A convenient theory, considering he'd recently developed an interest in a lady named Anne Boleyn. Thus began the world's most expensive and catastrophic breakup. Henry spent 7 years begging the Pope for an annulment. When the Pope said no, partly because he didn't want to annoy Spain, Henry decided to invent his own church instead. The Church of England was born. All because one man couldn't take rejection gracefully. Anne Boleyn, the dangerous charm. Anne Boleyn wasn't a passive figure in this mess. She was clever, witty, and aware that her power depended on maintaining Henry's obsession, but never quite giving him what he wanted. She refused to become his mistress, which only made him more desperate. By the time they married, Henry had destroyed his first marriage, alienated the Pope, and set England on fire, metaphorically and sometimes literally. When Anne finally gave birth, it was a girl, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but hopeful. Until Anne miscarried a son. That was enough. Rumors spread. Whispers of witchcraft, adultery, even incest, all ridiculous, but useful. And was arrested, tried, and executed within months. Henry didn't even attend. He was too busy planning his next wedding. Jane Seymour, the favorite ghost. Jane Seymour was wife number 3, quiet, obedient, and everything and wasn't. She managed to do what Catherine and couldn't, give Henry a son. Finally, the heir he'd ruined 2 marriages for. Unfortunately, childbirth in the 1500s was less a medical event and more a gamble with mortality. Jane died soon after giving birth to Prince Edward. Henry was heartbroken, or at least, as heartbroken as a man could be who had previously executed his last wife. He declared Jane his true love, which mostly meant she was the only one who hadn't outlived his temper. And of Cleves, the political disaster. By this point, Henry was older, heavier, and increasingly unpleasant. But Europe still needed his friendship, so a marriage alliance was proposed with a German princess named Anne of Cleves. Henry agreed after seeing her portrait, a flattering one painted by Hans Holbein. When it arrived in person, Henry was horrified. "She is nothing so fair as she hath been painted," he reportedly said, a line that could ruin any date, anywhere. The wedding still went ahead, but the marriage was annulled after 6 months. Anne took it graciously, accepted a large estate, and lived quietly for the rest of her life, one of the few people to survive Henry's affection. Catherine Howard, the teenage mistake. Next came Catherine Howard, a teenager with more energy than judgment. She was young, lively, and disastrously unfaithful. Henry, now obese and paranoid, believed she was his last chance at happiness. When rumors of her affairs reached him, the fury was volcanic. Catherine was executed in 1542, allegedly screaming for mercy on the scaffold. Henry didn't attend. He rarely did. By this time, even his courtiers were exhausted. The king had transformed from a Renaissance prince into a haunted tyrant, limping on a festering leg, surrounded by empty chairs at dinner. Catherine Parr, the survivor. Wife number 6, Catherine Parr, deserves more credit than she gets. She managed to outlive Henry, a feat in itself. She nursed his wounds, managed his moods, and quietly promoted religious reform when it was safe to do so. When Henry finally died in 1547, she probably whispered a polite thank you to whichever saint handled royal endurance. The short, sad reign of Edward VI. Henry's precious son, Edward VI, became king at 9 years old. He was intelligent, serious, and heartbreakingly frail. Edward tried to continue his father's Protestant reforms, but his body gave out before his 16th birthday. He died in bed, quietly, like someone who had seen enough chaos for a lifetime. His death sparked a power struggle so confusing that even historians occasionally sigh halfway through explaining it. Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen. Edward had been persuaded to name his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his heir. She was 17, scholarly, and completely uninterested in being queen. But politics has a way of ignoring personal preference. Jane was proclaimed queen in 1553, and dethroned 9 days later by Henry's eldest daughter, Mary. She was executed soon after, one more tragic footnote in a dynasty that treated thrones like musical chairs. Mary I, the queen who tried too hard. Mary, known to history as Bloody Mary, was determined to restore Catholicism in England. She wasn't actually as monstrous as her nickname suggests, but she was certainly enthusiastic. Hundreds of Protestants were burned at the stake during her reign. She married Philip of Spain, a man who found her devotion flattering but not especially interesting. She longed for children but suffered multiple false pregnancies, which must have been heartbreaking. When she died, England mourned her politely, and then immediately moved on. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who outlived them all. Then came Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter. The girl no one had expected to rule. She had survived prison, plots, and execution orders from her own sister. By the time she became queen, she was both cautious and brilliant, a ruler who learned from everyone else's mistakes. Elizabeth understood image better than any monarch before her. She turned her unmarried status into a myth, the virgin queen wedded to her country. It wasn't true, but it worked. Under her reign, England flourished. Art, exploration, poetry, all while she carefully managed the impossible task of ruling men who thought women shouldn't rule at all. She was witty, ruthless when necessary, and fiercely independent. By the end of her reign, she had no direct heir, but she had something rarer: respect. The Tudors ended with Elizabeth, the one who didn't marry, didn't have children, and didn't destroy everything in sight. A neat symmetry, if you think about it. The family began with a man who would do anything for a throne, and ended with a woman who learned how to sit on one without losing her soul. Soft pause. So if you're drifting now, picture Elizabeth alone in her golden chamber, surrounded by silence. A dynasty behind her, a nation ahead of her. And perhaps, somewhere in that quiet, she knew she'd done what none of them could. She'd survived being a Tudor. Hey everyone. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've made it through the Tudors, which means you've already witnessed enough royal drama to fill a dozen soap operas in several centuries. But tonight, we're gliding east, to meet a family that didn't just flirt with disaster. They married it. Repeatedly. Because while other dynasties fought wars for power, the Habsburgs took a slightly different route. They just kept marrying each other until the entire continent was theirs, and their jawlines paid the price. So, dim the lights. Take a deep breath. And let's drift into the slow, inevitable collapse of Europe's most inbred dynasty. The motto that should have been a warning. The Habsburgs had a saying. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. And they took it seriously. Over the centuries, the Habsburgs managed to rule half of Europe not by conquest, but by marriage contracts. Spain, Austria, Hungary, the Netherlands, all stitched together through a careful pattern of wedding vows and shared grandparents. It worked, politically. Genetically, not so much. You see, when your cousins are also your in-laws, your uncles, and your potential spouses, things get complicated. Not romantically. Just biologically. The rise of the Habsburgs. It all began innocently enough in medieval Austria. A modest noble family with ambitious marriage plans. They didn't have much land at first, but they had determination and a remarkable tolerance for family reunions. By the time of Emperor Maximilian I in the late 1400s, they'd mastered the art of marrying upward. Maximilian himself wed Mary of Burgundy, gaining a fortune, a crown, and a lifelong reminder that sometimes, love really is about property acquisition. Their children continued the pattern, marrying into Spanish and Hungarian royalty. And before long, the Habsburgs ruled an empire so vast it was said the sun never set on it. It did, however, occasionally pass out from exhaustion. The Habsburg jaw, a family heirloom. Now, it's impossible to discuss the Habsburgs without mentioning the jaw. That unmistakable protruding chin that became a sort of accidental family crest. It wasn't just a feature, it was a statement. So pronounced that it looked like some of them could open letters with it. It developed slowly over generations of cousin marriages. Each one adding a little more to the structure until, by the 17th century, the Habsburg profile was unmistakable, part royal, part geological formation. Portraits from the era are subtle about it. Painters would soften the chin, tilt the head, or hide it with a beard. But the resemblance across the generations was undeniable. It became both a symbol of their power and the most visible warning against their marital strategy. Charles II of Spain, the final product. And so, naturally, we arrive at the most famous Habsburg of them all. Charles II of Spain. The tragic, and oddly endearing, embodiment of genetic determination. Born in 1661, Charles was the result of nearly 2 centuries of non-stop inbreeding. His family tree looked less like a tree and more like a very determined shrub. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also related. And so on, until there were fewer new genes in the pool than in a thimble of royal blood. Charles himself was frail, sickly, and almost entirely toothless. He struggled to chew, to speak clearly, and to understand what was happening around him most of the time. He suffered from seizures, depression, and an array of mysterious ailments that baffled his doctors, though genetics would have been the obvious diagnosis, had anyone dared say it. A life of tragedy and strange hope. Despite all this, Charles was kind. Gentle, even. His subjects called him El Hechizado, meaning the bewitched, because they genuinely thought he was cursed. Which, to be fair, he sort of was, by DNA. His life was managed entirely by court advisors and priests who blamed every illness on witchcraft or sin. He tried to rule, but decisions often overwhelmed him. Even reading tired him out. He married twice, first to a French princess, then to a German one, in the faint hope of producing an heir. He didn't. His body simply wasn't capable. When he died at 38, Spain mourned him sincerely. He had been more a symbol than a sovereign, the gentle ghost of a dynasty collapsing under its own weight. The empire that devoured itself. Charles II's death in 1700 triggered a massive succession crisis. There were no heirs left in Spain, because everyone was related to everyone else. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, an international brawl to decide who got to inherit a royal mess. And, fittingly, the Habsburgs lost Spain entirely. Their genetic dynasty had reached its natural end. But don't worry, they still had plenty of cousins left in Austria to keep the name alive. Because, of course, they did. The Austrian line, too stubborn to quit. While Spain's Habsburgs faded, the Austrian branch kept going strong. Maria Theresa, one of the few genuinely competent rulers in the family, took over in the 18th century. She was intelligent, pragmatic, and surprisingly warm-hearted, though she still managed to marry off most of her 16 children for political reasons. One of those children was Marie Antoinette, who you may remember for her unfortunate encounter with the French Revolution. Maria Theresa had tried to teach her children diplomacy, grace, and restraint. Marie learned fashion, gossip, and how to say "let them eat cake," which she never actually said, but the rumor was simply too entertaining to die. The Habsburg persistence. Even as empires rose and fell, the Habsburgs endured. They ruled Austria-Hungary until the early 20th century, when World War I finally brought their story to a close. Emperor Franz Joseph had reigned for nearly 70 years, an impressive run, though by the end, he looked like someone who'd seen every possible mistake repeated twice. His heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was famously assassinated in Sarajevo, an event that set off the First World War. Which means, in a way, the Habsburgs didn't just rule Europe. They also helped blow it up on the way out. A dynasty in decline. When the empire finally collapsed in 1918, the last emperor, Charles I, was exiled. He lived modestly in Switzerland and died young. A quiet, melancholy end to 6 centuries of royal missteps. The Habsburgs still exist today, as private citizens, art collectors, and occasional interview subjects. They're charming, articulate, and mercifully distant from their genetic experiments of the past. But their legacy remains a strange, glittering cautionary tale. That absolute power, and a refusal to diversify your DNA, can produce both an empire and an evolutionary dead end. Soft pause. So if you're still awake, imagine the candlelight flickering across a Habsburg portrait. A pale face, a heavy crown, and that unmistakable chin. The weight of history, and genetics, pressing quietly down through the centuries. And somewhere in the stillness, perhaps you can almost hear it. The faint echo of a royal toast, murmured in Latin, celebrating another cousin's wedding. Because that's how it all began, and, fittingly, how it all ended. Hey everyone. If you've drifted this far, I congratulate your endurance. Tonight, we're floating softly into the age of powdered wigs, golden mirrors, and people fainting from corsets. Welcome to the world of Louis XIV, the man who quite literally thought the universe revolved around him. You've probably heard his nickname, the Sun King. It's elegant, poetic, radiant, and, as we'll discover, just a touch excessive. Because when Louis said he was the center of everything, he wasn't being metaphorical. He meant it. So, settle in. The lights of Versailles are flickering. The courtiers are gossiping in silk. And the most self-assured monarch in history is about to rise. Born to be worshipped. Louis XIV was born in 1638 after more than 20 years of his parents trying, and failing, to produce an heir. His mother, Anne of Austria, believed his birth was a miracle. His father, Louis XIII, mostly believed it was about time. The French people, ever dramatic, called him Dieudan, God-given. And that was the tone set for his entire life, divine, inevitable, and ever so slightly unbearable. As a child, Louis was showered with adoration. Every gesture, every word, every sneeze was treated as a sign of royal perfection. If he cried, courtiers applauded his emotional depth. If he smiled, they declared it a blessing. If he tripped, someone probably fell down before him just to make it look intentional. So yes, he grew up a little spoiled. The boy king. Louis became king at the age of 4. Which, as you can imagine, did not make for efficient governance. The country was run by his mother and her advisor, Cardinal Mazarin, an Italian cleric who had all the warmth of a damp candle and all the ambition of a shark in silk robes. During this time, France was in chaos. There were rebellions, uprisings, and noble tantrums. The young king even had to flee Paris when the aristocracy decided they didn't feel like paying taxes anymore. This period, called the Fronde, left a deep mark on him. He learned early that nobles couldn't be trusted, and that Paris was full of people who didn't appreciate being governed by a toddler. So, when he finally took power, he made a decision that would define his reign. If the nobility couldn't behave, he'd trap them somewhere beautiful and watch them from every angle. Building the Palace of Ego. Versailles. A name that still drips with gold, perfume, and faintly ridiculous excess. Originally, it was just a hunting lodge outside Paris. Louis decided to turn it into a monument to himself, a palace so enormous and magnificent that it would humiliate anyone who entered. Construction began in 1661, and it never really stopped. Over the decades, thousands of workers built fountains, halls, gardens, and apartments for hundreds of courtiers. The cost was astronomical, though conveniently, no one dared tell him exactly how much. The center of the palace was the Hall of Mirrors, a glittering corridor filled with candlelight and reflections of Louis himself. He'd walk there each morning, his image stretching endlessly in every direction, a literal vision of divine infinity. Because when your ego's the size of France, you need proper lighting. Life at Versailles. To live at Versailles was both an honor and a punishment. The nobility begged for permission to stay near the king, even if it meant sleeping in broom closets and dressing rooms. Every part of daily life became a ritual. Louis woke at dawn to a ceremony called the Lever du Roi, the rising of the king. Dozens of nobles gathered just to watch him wake up. Some handed him his shirt. Others brushed his wig. A few lucky souls were permitted to pass him a handkerchief. It sounds absurd. But in that world, proximity to power was power. Being the man who handed the king his sock could mean the difference between fortune and obscurity. Everything revolved around him, meals, ceremonies, even bedtime. When he went to sleep, courtiers stood silently around the bed like polite vampires, waiting for him to close his eyes before sneaking off. The art of looking important. Louis XIV mastered the performance of majesty. He controlled how people saw him with obsessive precision. He wore towering wigs to make himself appear taller. He preferred red heels, the mark of nobility, and insisted only his courtiers could wear them, ensuring that Versailles looked like a strangely formal dance recital. Even his walk was rehearsed. He practiced a slow, deliberate stride meant to convey both grace and absolute dominance. If you saw him approaching, you were supposed to freeze, bow, and thank God you existed in the same century. His portraits, painted by Charles Le Brun and Rigaud, show him surrounded by drapery, clouds, and columns, all designed to make his 5'4" frame look like an immortal titan. The Sun King. The symbol of his reign was, of course, the sun. Louis believed himself to be the earthly reflection of divine order, steady, radiant, and all-powerful. He even performed as Apollo, the sun god, in elaborate ballets. Because naturally, being king wasn't quite theatrical enough. In one performance, he appeared in golden armor and literally shone under hundreds of candles, while his courtiers danced in orbit around him like obedient planets. It was a little on the nose. But everyone applauded, because no one wanted to risk being exiled to somewhere without chandeliers. A day in the life of radiance. Let's drift, just for a moment, through one of Louis's typical days. At 8, he rises, to applause. By 9, he's dressed in layers of silk and lace that could probably support their own ecosystem. He eats breakfast publicly, surrounded by nobles pretending not to stare. Then come meetings, ceremonies, and a carefully staged walk through the gardens. Servants follow, fanning him, carrying umbrellas, and occasionally fainting from heat exhaustion. Lunch is another performance, dozens of dishes, each served in order of importance, while the king discusses theology, architecture, or the superiority of his own taste. Evenings bring more ceremonies, operas, and dancing. At midnight, the coucher du roi, the ritual of going to bed, takes place. He is undressed, blessed, and tucked in like a royal toddler. Then the doors close, and the gossip resumes. Mistresses and morality. Of course, no 17th century monarch would be complete without a complicated romantic life. Louis's mistresses were as famous as his wars, and often just as expensive. His first great love was Louise de la Valliere, gentle, pious, and perpetually apologetic. Then came Madame de Montespan, witty, ambitious, and slightly terrifying. She dominated Versailles for years, throwing lavish parties and allegedly dabbling in dark magic to keep his affection. After her came Madame de Maintenon, who preferred religion to romance and managed to tame him, at least temporarily. Each woman influenced policy, patronage, and palace intrigue. Each one also had to navigate the exhausting theater of court life, where every glance could ruin a reputation. The endless wars. While Louis danced and dazzled at home, he also kept Europe very busy abroad. He fought wars with Spain, the Netherlands, and practically everyone else within marching distance. He expanded France's borders but drained its treasury in the process. Tens of thousands of soldiers died, entire villages vanished, and taxes soared. But Versailles remained radiant. By the late years of his reign, France was financially exhausted. The people starved while the fountains of Versailles flowed day and night, fueled by water pumps so vast they were nicknamed the madness of engineers. Even the sun can cast a long shadow. The sunset of a king. Louis XIV reigned for 72 years, longer than any European monarch in history. By the end, his legs were covered in ulcers, his teeth were gone, and his endless court rituals had become slow parodies of themselves. His son, grandson, and great-grandson all died before him. He was survived only by a small great-grandson, the future Louis XV, who would inherit both the throne and the mountain of debt that came with it. On his deathbed, Louis reportedly said, "I loved war too much." Then, after a pause, he added, "Don't follow my example in anything." Which was surprisingly self-aware, though, naturally, his descendants ignored him completely. Soft pause. So as you drift into sleep, picture the glittering halls of Versailles at dusk. The chandeliers fading. The courtiers gone. Only the echo of footsteps, the soft rustle of silk, and the faint reflection of a man who believed himself the sun. And outside, beyond the gilded walls, the real night falling, quiet, infinite, and utterly unimpressed. Hey everyone. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you're drifting off, even better. Tonight, we're gliding eastward through candlelight and snow, to the cold palaces of Imperial Russia. And there, we'll find a woman who clawed her way to the top of a crumbling empire. Only to discover that ruling the largest country on earth was, in fact, a deeply tiring experience. Catherine the Great, the most famous empress of Russia, and perhaps one of the most overanalyzed people in European history. She was brilliant. She was ruthless. She was, at times, sincerely bored. And like most people who ruled absolute monarchies, she had no idea when to stop improving things, or herself. So, pull up a fur blanket. The palace halls are echoing with the sound of boots on marble, and the snow is piling softly against the windows. Let's drift into the long, glittering, and quietly absurd reign of Catherine the Great. From princess to pawn. Catherine wasn't Russian. Not even close. She was born Sophia von Holtzerbst in a tiny German principality, the kind of place where everyone was related and half the nobility was mildly anemic. Her father was a Prussian officer. Her mother was ambitious and slightly unbearable. When Sophie was 15, her mother heard that the Russian Empress, Elizabeth, was looking for a bride for her nephew, the future Peter III. And like any 18th century parent with delusions of grandeur, she immediately thought, "Perfect, let's marry my daughter off to someone unstable and foreign." The match was arranged. Sophie learned Russian, converted to Orthodoxy, and changed her name to Yekaterina, or Catherine. She was smart, disciplined, and genuinely fascinated by Russian culture. Her husband was not. Enter Peter III. Peter was the grandson of Peter the Great, a man who modernized Russia through sheer force of will and occasional acts of domestic terrorism. Unfortunately, the grandson did not inherit much of the greatness. Peter adored Prussia. He idolized Frederick the Great, spoke terrible Russian, and filled his bedroom with toy soldiers. He would spend hours drilling them, barking orders, and occasionally punishing them for insubordination. It was not an especially sexy hobby. Catherine, meanwhile, was intelligent, well-read, and acutely aware that her husband was, to put it gently, a few rubles short of a ruble. Their marriage was a disaster from the start. He insulted her publicly, ignored her privately, and reportedly preferred playing war games to producing an heir. So Catherine decided she'd have to produce one on her own, socially speaking, at least. The heir problem. After years of humiliation, Catherine took lovers. This was standard practice in European courts, a sort of open secret among monarchs and their bored spouses. Eventually, she gave birth to a son, Paul. The father's identity remains, shall we say, debatable. Empress Elizabeth was thrilled. She whisked the baby away to raise him herself, leaving Catherine with nothing but the vague satisfaction of having technically done her job. But the birth secured Catherine's position. She was now the mother of the heir, even if no one was entirely sure who the father was. Peter's glorious, brief reign. When Empress Elizabeth died in 1762, Peter III finally became emperor. He lasted 6 months. In that short time, he managed to alienate everyone, nobles, clergy, army officers, even the guards who were supposed to protect him. He withdrew from Russia's war against Prussia, his childhood crush, and spent his days making soldiers wear Prussian uniforms while he played with his wooden regiment. Catherine saw the disaster unfolding and made a decision. If her husband was going to destroy the empire, she might as well take it from him first. The coup. In July 1762, Catherine staged one of the smoothest coups in European history. While Peter was off playing soldier, she rallied the Imperial Guard, rode through St. Petersburg in full military uniform, and declared herself Empress of Russia. The army and the church both backed her. Peter, faced with overwhelming force, surrendered without a fight. A week later, he was found dead, accidentally strangled during a scuffle, which, in 18th century political language, meant very much on purpose. Catherine, now empress, mourned him publicly with impeccable decorum, and privately redecorated his rooms. Enlightened despotism, or how to rule with style. Catherine saw herself as an enlightened monarch. She read Voltaire, corresponded with Diderot, and filled her palace with French philosophers who had fled their own countries for saying too many clever things. She wanted Russia to be modern, rational, and prosperous, which, unfortunately, was a difficult combination in a land where serfs still made up 90% of the population. She wrote essays about justice, efficiency, and education. Then, in practice, decided that freeing the serfs was a nice idea for later. It was easier to talk about progress than to implement it. Still, she did build schools, hospitals, libraries, and new towns. She imported architects from Italy, artists from France, and fashion from everywhere. Under her, Russia's court became one of the most dazzling and exhausting in Europe. The lovers. Now, Catherine's love life is often the first thing people bring up. Usually with a knowing look, a smirk, and a complete misunderstanding of history. Yes, she had lovers, several, in fact. But these were political relationships as much as personal ones. She often promoted her favorites to high office, showered them with gifts, then dismissed them gracefully when she was bored. Grigory Orlov helped her seize power during the coup. Later came Grigory Potemkin, brilliant, eccentric, and arguably the love of her life. Potemkin wasn't just a romantic partner. He was a general, a builder, and Catherine's most trusted advisor. Together they expanded Russia southward, colonized Crimea, and built new cities that bore names like Ekaterinoslav, which, yes, literally means Catherine's glory. When he died, she mourned him deeply, and possibly, quietly, forever. The Potemkin villages. One of the most famous legends from Catherine's reign involves Potemkin villages. The story goes that Potemkin, to impress her during an inspection tour, built fake villages along the river, elaborate facades with painted windows and rented peasants waving cheerfully. Modern historians suspect this was exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated. But it's still a perfect metaphor for Catherine's rule: beautiful surfaces, slightly hollow underneath. She genuinely believed in reform, but she also loved control. Her modern Russia gleamed with marble and order, while beneath it, millions of serfs still lived and died in bondage. The Pugachev Rebellion. Reality caught up in 1773. A former soldier named Yemelian Pugachev declared himself the real Peter III, claiming he'd survived the coup, and led a massive peasant revolt. Tens of thousands joined him. They burned estates, killed nobles, and proclaimed freedom for all serfs. Catherine, horrified, sent in the army. The rebellion was crushed. Pugachev was executed in Moscow, his head displayed publicly as a warning. After that, Catherine quietly stopped talking about liberty. Progress, she decided, was best handled slowly, or not at all. The aging empress. By her later years, Catherine had become the very image of imperial grandeur. She expanded Russia's borders to their greatest extent, modernized its bureaucracy, and filled her palaces with art that now fills entire museums. But she was also lonely. Her son, Paul, resented her for usurping his father. Her court was full of flatterers and schemers. And the Enlightenment philosophers she once adored were now calling for revolutions, which, inconveniently, she could not endorse without losing her head. Still, she worked tirelessly. Even in her 60s, she was writing letters, reviewing laws, and reading until dawn. When she finally died in 1796, she left behind an empire larger, richer, and more complicated than any before it. The myths. Now, about those infamous rumors, the ones whispered about Catherine for centuries. Let's be clear, they're nonsense. The horse story, as it's sometimes called, was fabricated years after her death by enemies eager to mock a powerful woman. It says a lot more about European misogyny than about Catherine herself. She wasn't scandalous, she was successful. And that, for many men of her time, was scandal enough. The last reflection. So, as we drift away from St. Petersburg and into sleep, picture the Winter Palace at night. Catherine at her desk, candles burning low, papers spread across the table. Outside, the Neva River frozen under moonlight. The Empress sighs, dips her pen, and keeps writing, chasing the impossible dream of perfect rule in an imperfect world. And maybe that's why she fascinates us still. She wasn't just a ruler or a reformer. She was a woman who wanted to bring light to an empire built on ice, and found herself, inevitably, standing somewhere between brilliance and exhaustion. Hey everyone! Tonight, let's drift across the North Sea, into the misty gardens and marble corridors of Georgian England. It's the late 18th century. The wigs are enormous. The tea is overboiled. And somewhere in the royal palace, King George III is having what might best be described as a very long, very public breakdown. He was called the Farmer King, the Mad King, and occasionally, Your Majesty, please stop talking to that tree. But behind the legend, behind the ridicule and the powdered hair, there was a man who just wanted to do his job well, and whose mind, tragically, didn't always cooperate. So, settle in. The fire is crackling low, the hour is late, and we're going to drift softly through the reign of King George III, the monarch who lost America, his mind, and eventually, his ability to tell which one hurt more. The dutiful boy. George was born in 1738, the grandson of King George II. He was a shy, serious child, the kind who blushed easily and apologized for things that weren't his fault. He loved books, astronomy, and music, and had an almost painful sense of duty. When he became king at just 22, he said, "I glory in the name of Britain." Which sounded noble, but mostly meant he was about to spend decades trying, and failing, to keep his empire from falling apart. He was deeply religious, loyal to his wife, and earnestly devoted to moral behavior. In short, he was the complete opposite of nearly every other European monarch of his time. He didn't gamble, didn't keep mistresses, and tried to run the government like a well-managed household. Naturally, everyone found this infuriating. The married king. George's marriage to Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was arranged, as all good royal love stories were. They met for the first time on their wedding day. And, miraculously, it worked. Charlotte was intelligent, kind, and just as socially awkward as he was. Together, they had 15 children, because apparently, that's what happens when two introverts discover shared hobbies. They spent evenings reading aloud, playing music, and gardening. George loved to experiment with crops and livestock, earning him the affectionate nickname Farmer George. It was meant as a joke, but he genuinely liked it. Unfortunately, managing a farm is far simpler than managing a global empire. The American problem. The trouble began with those famously rebellious colonies across the Atlantic. George didn't hate the Americans. In fact, he never wanted war. But he did expect them to pay for their own defense, a radical concept, apparently. So, when Parliament introduced taxes on things like paper, tea, and stamps, the colonists were outraged. They sent pamphlets, protests, and eventually bullets. George believed giving in would destroy the empire's authority. The Americans believed obedience would destroy theirs. And so, two very stubborn groups decided to ruin each other's evenings for the next 8 years. By 1783, Britain had officially lost the 13 colonies. It was humiliating. Cartoonists drew George as a fool, philosophers called him a tyrant, and his government nearly collapsed. But George himself stayed calm, at least on the surface. He told Parliament, "I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made, I will be the first to meet the friendship of America as an independent power." It was the dignified equivalent of saying, "Fine. I'm not mad. Just disappointed." The mind begins to slip. After the loss of America, the king threw himself into work. He read state papers obsessively, sometimes rising at 4 a.m. to begin the day. He attended cabinet meetings, inspected troops, and wrote long, rambling letters to his ministers, occasionally signing them with extra flourishes, as though his pen were as anxious as his mind. And then, slowly, something began to go wrong. In 1788, George fell ill. At first, it looked like exhaustion, too many late nights and too much stress. But soon he began to talk endlessly, pacing rooms, shouting incoherently, and making wild gestures. He once spoke for hours without stopping, until foam gathered at his mouth. He wrote long letters to Parliament filled with strange digressions about theology, destiny, and, quite memorably, asparagus. Doctors, who were essentially well-dressed guessers, diagnosed him with everything from hot blood to royal melancholy. He was kept in Windsor Castle, restrained when necessary, and attended by physicians who bled him regularly, because, of course, that always helped. The gentle madness. Despite what later stories claimed, George was not raving mad. He was intelligent, gentle, and self-aware, trapped in waves of confusion he couldn't control. Modern historians believe he suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that can cause hallucinations, pain, and discolored urine. Others argue it was bipolar disorder, worsened by the treatments he received. Whatever the cause, his lucid moments were heartbreaking. He would recover for months, even years, apologizing to his family for the trouble he'd caused. Then the illness would return, sudden, cruel, and disorienting. He sometimes mistook courtiers for his deceased relatives. He talked to imaginary people. He once greeted a tree in Windsor Park as though it were the King of Prussia. And yet, he remained unfailingly polite while doing it. There was no violence, no chaos, just endless talking and an undercurrent of sorrow. The Queen's sorrow. Queen Charlotte adored her husband, but as his episodes grew worse, she withdrew emotionally. It was too painful to watch the man she'd loved for decades unravel in front of her. She moved into separate quarters, saw him only occasionally, and focused on raising their many children. The palace grew heavy with silence. Their eldest son, the future George IV, waited impatiently for his father to lose power, and spent his days drinking, gambling, and accumulating debts that could finance a small war. He was the living embodiment of everything George III despised: vain, lazy, and flamboyant. When Parliament finally declared the regency in 1811, transferring power to the prince, George III was already blind, deaf, and permanently deranged. He never knew that his beloved daughter Amelia had died. He spent his final years in isolation, talking to the shadows of his past. The legacy. George III reigned for 59 years, one of the longest reigns in British history. He presided over revolutions, wars, and the dawn of the Industrial Age. He saw the empire shrink, then begin to expand again. And through it all, he remained, in his heart, a man who just wanted everything to be tidy and moral. His illness made him a figure of pity and ridicule in equal measure. But in many ways, he was one of Britain's most conscientious monarchs, hard-working, frugal, and stubbornly decent. In a court filled with corruption, he was honest. In an age of excess, he was modest. And in a world that rewarded charm over substance, he was deeply, painfully sincere. So, as you drift off now, imagine the aging king sitting by a window at Windsor, the twilight soft over the gardens. He hums a hymn to himself, one he's forgotten the words to, and smiles faintly at something only he can see. The candle flickers. The air is quiet. And the man once mocked as mad simply sits in peace, surrounded by the soft rustle of history moving on without him. Because even kings, in the end, deserve a little rest. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're gliding softly into 18th century France, a world of powdered faces, towering wigs, and an economy held together mostly by denial. Paris, at this time, was glittering and grim all at once. The aristocracy floated through balls and operas like rare birds, while the rest of the population ate bread crusts and wished the rare birds would trip on their own gowns. And in the middle of all that, we find her. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. The woman history loves to misunderstand. She's remembered for one phrase she almost certainly never said. Let them eat cake. And yet, that single line, fake or not, somehow captures everything people thought she was: out of touch, spoiled, and spectacularly unaware. But as with most famous villains of history, the truth is softer, sadder, and much more human. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Because tonight, we're drifting through the tragic, gilded life of the girl who became the symbol of an empire's collapse. The child bride of Europe. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755, the youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, who had 16 children, because apparently, royal wombs were state infrastructure. As the 15th child, Marie was considered expendable, perfect diplomatic material. So, when she was just 14, her mother arranged her marriage to the French Dauphin, the future King Louis XVI. The idea was simple: unite Austria and France in friendship. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Everything went wrong. Marie left Vienna, her home, her friends, and even her clothes behind at the border. Literally, she had to be stripped, washed, and redressed entirely in French garments before crossing into her new kingdom. It was a symbolic rebirth. And, like most symbolic rebirths, it was mainly uncomfortable and humiliating. Versailles, a palace of perfume and paranoia. When she arrived at Versailles, Marie Antoinette entered a world so artificial it made modern reality TV look grounded. The palace was beautiful, yes, but it smelled like 4,000 people and zero plumbing. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was a survival tactic. Court life revolved around absurd etiquette. The queen couldn't dress herself, that was the job of the Dame d'honneur, Dame d'Atours, and about 6 other women who specialized in holding sleeves. Even brushing her hair was a spectator sport. Her every movement was watched, criticized, and dissected by courtiers whose main hobbies were gossip and resentment. And then there was her husband. The awkward king. Louis XVI was not a monster. He was a quiet, shy, slightly pudgy man who loved clocks, keys, and long silences. If you picture an earnest schoolboy trapped in the body of a reluctant monarch, you've got the idea. He and Marie Antoinette married as teenagers, and for 7 long years, they didn't consummate the marriage. 7 years. Historians have argued endlessly over why. Some say he had a medical issue, others that he was simply nervous. Whatever the reason, Europe noticed. Pamphlets circulated mocking the impotent king and the barren queen. Eventually, the issue was resolved, with a bit of medical advice from Marie's brother, Emperor Joseph II, who essentially sent a letter saying, "Just try harder." Apparently, that worked. Because not long after, the royal nursery began to fill up. The queen of fashion. Once her personal life settled, Marie turned her energy towards style, and she was very good at it. She became the fashion trendsetter of Europe. Her towering hairstyles could fit small birds, model ships, and possibly a few moral lessons. Her dresses were rivers of silk and lace. And the bills were astronomical. To her, fashion was a form of expression, a way to breathe in a life that didn't allow much individuality. But to the struggling French public, it looked like pure arrogance. They nicknamed her Madame Deficit. Every time bread prices rose, they blamed her gowns. Every time taxes went up, they imagined her buying another diamond necklace. Which brings us to the diamond necklace scandal. The scandal that wasn't. In 1785, a con artist named Jean de la Motte tricked a gullible cardinal into buying a 1.6 million livre diamond necklace for the queen. Marie Antoinette had nothing to do with it. She didn't even like the jeweler who made it. But when the fraud came to light, everyone assumed she was behind it. The scandal exploded. Pamphlets depicted her as a greedy seductress. Cartoons mocked her supposed extravagance. And public opinion, already bad, plummeted into the abyss. It didn't matter that she was innocent. The myth of the heartless queen was too satisfying to give up. Petit Trianon, the escape. Tired of the constant scrutiny, Marie retreated to the Petit Trianon, a small chateau within the Versailles grounds. There, she built a little fantasy village called Le Hameau de la Reine, complete with cottages, gardens, and dairy cows. She dressed as a shepherdess, tended flowers, and played at rustic simplicity. To her, it was freedom. To her critics, it was mockery. A queen pretending to live like a peasant while real peasants starved just beyond the palace walls. In reality, she wasn't cruel, just hopelessly insulated. Marie had been raised in privilege, surrounded by servants and ceremony. She didn't understand what hunger meant. And when she finally did, it was far too late. The fall of the monarchy. By the late 1780s, France was bankrupt, angry, and armed with Enlightenment ideals. Taxes crushed the poor while nobles lived tax-free. Food shortages sparked riots. And revolution was in the air. In October 1789, a mob of women, furious about bread prices, marched to Versailles. They broke into the palace, killed guards, and demanded the royal family return to Paris. Marie barely escaped with her life. She and Louis were forced to live in the Tuileries Palace, essentially under house arrest. She tried to flee the country in 1791, disguised as a governess. But her family was recognized, captured, and dragged back to Paris. It was over. The last days. In 1793, after Louis XVI was executed, Marie was imprisoned in the conciergerie, a cold, damp cell that smelled of mildew and despair. Her health collapsed. Her hair turned white in a matter of weeks. She wrote letters to her sister, to her children, to God, all gentle, dignified, and heartbreaking. She refused to plead for mercy, even when facing the guillotine. Her last words, when she accidentally stepped on her executioner's foot, were, "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." That was Marie Antoinette, polite to the end. The legacy of the Queen. History painted her as a villain, a symbol of everything wrong with monarchy. But in truth, she was a confused young woman placed in an impossible position, too naive to understand the system she represented, and too visible to escape it. She was never cruel. Just terribly unlucky. She loved her children, adored music and theater, and longed for a simple life she was never allowed to have. Her story endures because it captures that painful contrast between luxury and loneliness, between power and helplessness. So, as you drift off tonight, picture her not as the haughty queen of propaganda, but as a lonely woman in a silent palace, listening to the faint sound of laughter outside, wondering what went wrong. The chandeliers still glitter. The candles still burn. But the music has long since stopped. And in that stillness, history exhales. Good evening. Tonight, we're heading deep into the frozen heart of old Russia, a land of endless forests, candlelit churches, and thrones carved from fear. And sitting on that throne is a man whose name alone can send a chill through history. Ivan IV. Better known as Ivan the Terrible. But here's the thing, in Russian, the word Grozny doesn't mean terrible the way we think of it. It means formidable, awe-inspiring, even fearsome. Ivan wasn't terrible in the sense of being bad at his job. He was terrible in the sense that lightning is terrible, brilliant, destructive, and impossible to look away from. So, close your eyes. The wind outside is howling through snow-covered spires. Somewhere in the dark, bells toll from the Kremlin. And the young Tsar of all Russia is about to lose his mind. The lonely child. Ivan was born in 1530, and from the start, his life was soaked in blood and betrayal. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died when Ivan was just 3. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, ruled as regent for a few short years before she was likely poisoned. After that, chaos. The boy who was meant to rule Russia became a prisoner in his own palace. Noble families, the boyars, fought over power, treating Ivan like a piece on a chessboard. They starved him, ignored him, and sometimes even beat him. So he watched. And he remembered. One story tells of a day when young Ivan, only 13, snapped. He ordered one of the cruelest boyars thrown to a pack of hunting dogs. And from that day on, no one forgot who he was. The Crown of Fire. At 16, Ivan was crowned the first Tsar of all Rus. Not prince, not duke, Tsar, from Caesar. He was claiming divine, absolute authority. To him, Russia wasn't a kingdom, it was a holy empire. And he, its chosen ruler. In the beginning, he was surprisingly good at the job. He reformed laws, built a standing army, and called together a council to modernize the government. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a kind, intelligent woman who seemed to soothe his volatile temper. For a while, Russia prospered. But then, Anastasia died. And something inside Ivan shattered. He believed she had been poisoned by the same boyars who tormented his childhood. The grief turned to paranoia. The paranoia turned to rage. And the Tsar of all Russia descended into madness. The birth of the Oprichnina. In 1565, Ivan did something unprecedented. He divided his realm in two. One part was governed as normal. The other became his personal domain, the Oprichnina. He filled it with his private army, the Albrichniki, men dressed in black, riding black horses, carrying dog heads and brooms on their saddles. The heads symbolized their duty to sniff out treason. The brooms, to sweep away the guilty. They terrorized the land, executing nobles, burning towns, and confiscating estates. No one was safe, not priests, not peasants, not even the Tsar's own family. Ivan would pray in the morning, attend torture sessions by afternoon, and listen to hymns while watching executions. He saw himself as God's instrument of judgment. But in truth, he was a man who'd lost everything: his trust, his love, and eventually, his soul. The tragedy of his son. The most haunting story of Ivan's reign came near its end. During a fit of rage in 1581, Ivan struck his son, the heir to the throne, with his iron staff. The blow crushed the young man's skull. When Ivan realized what he'd done, he fell to his knees, weeping, screaming for forgiveness. But it was too late. The boy died in his arms. That image, the Tsar cradling his dying son, horrified by his own violence, became one of the most famous in Russian art. Because in that moment, the terrible Tsar wasn't a monster. He was a broken man who'd finally seen what he'd become. The end of the terrible Tsar. Ivan ruled for 51 years, longer than almost any ruler of his time. He expanded Russia's borders, crushed its enemies, and turned a fractured state into a centralized empire. But he did it through fear, blood, and grief. By the time he died in 1584, sitting over a game of chess, Russia was exhausted, its people haunted, its nobles decimated, its throne uncertain. His death left behind a vacuum that would lead to decades of chaos, the time of troubles. And yet, history remembers him. Not just for the terror he spread, but for the power he built. He was the first to truly make Russia Russia. A mind split in two. Ivan the Terrible wasn't just evil or insane. He was both visionary and violent, a man shaped by trauma, faith, and loneliness. He prayed like a monk and killed like a demon. He saw enemies everywhere because, for much of his life, they were real. When you whisper his name, even now, it feels like frost creeping down your spine. Because Ivan teaches us something terrifying, that cruelty often begins with pain, and power only makes it louder. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the snow falling softly over the towers of Moscow. The golden domes glimmer in the moonlight. And deep in the echoing halls of the Kremlin, a shadow moves. A man sits alone by candlelight, praying for forgiveness that never came. Outside, the bells toll, deep, hollow, and endless. And history whispers back. Grozny. The fearsome one. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the banks of the Nile. The air is thick with the scent of lotus and incense. The moonlight glows against pale stone, reflecting on the calm river where papyrus boats drift like ghosts. And somewhere inside a candlelit palace in Alexandria, a woman is writing her name into history, and ensuring that no one ever forgets it. Her name is Cleopatra VII Philopator, last pharaoh of Egypt. And, somehow, still one of the most misunderstood people who ever lived. A kingdom already in trouble. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, in a palace that looked out over the Mediterranean. But Egypt, by then, wasn't the mighty empire of the pyramids anymore. It was more like a really nice Airbnb that the Romans were already eyeing. Her family, the Ptolemies, weren't even Egyptian by blood. They were Greek. Descendants of Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who had simply taken over Egypt when Alexander died. They'd ruled for centuries, but let's just say, not gracefully. Ptolemaic politics were like a soap opera written by someone who hates happy endings. Brothers married sisters, mothers poisoned sons, and nearly everyone named their children Ptolemy or Cleopatra, making family trees feel like bad jokes. By the time our Cleopatra came along, the dynasty was bloated with inbreeding and debt. Rome was the rising power in the West, and Egypt's independence hung by a thread. But Cleopatra was not her ancestors. She was brilliant. Educated in philosophy, politics, astronomy, and 9 languages. And unlike most Ptolemies, she actually learned to speak Egyptian, the language of her people. That alone made her unique. The girl who would be pharaoh. When her father, Ptolemy XII, died, Cleopatra was just 18. She inherited the throne alongside her younger brother, who was also, inconveniently, her husband. Because of course he was. Their joint rule didn't go well. The boy's advisors quickly turned against her, forcing Cleopatra to flee the capital. For a while, she wandered the deserts of Syria, raising an army and plotting her return. And then, a new player arrived. A Roman general named Julius Caesar. The carpet trick. This is where history slides into legend. Cleopatra, knowing she needed Rome's help to reclaim her throne, snuck back into Alexandria. But how do you get past guards who want you dead? You get creative. According to ancient writers, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters rolled up in a carpet. When unrolled, she emerged, young, radiant, and absolutely fearless. Imagine that entrance. After that, Caesar never really stood a chance. Was it love? Possibly. But more than that, it was strategy. Cleopatra knew that Egypt's survival depended on aligning with Rome, and she was the kind of woman who could make alliances feel personal. Caesar helped her reclaim her throne. Her brother conveniently drowned during the conflict, and Cleopatra became queen once more. The queen and the god. Cleopatra soon gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XV Caesar, nicknamed Caesarion, or Little Caesar. Subtle, right? Rome was scandalized. Caesar was already married. But Cleopatra didn't care. In her own land, she presented herself as the living goddess Isis, mother of Horus. And Rome, no matter how powerful, couldn't ignore her now. When she visited Caesar in Rome, she made an entrance worthy of myth, a golden barge gliding down the Tiber, sails of purple, servants fanning her with ostrich feathers. Romans whispered, mocked, and stared, but they couldn't look away. Of course, Caesar didn't last long. He was assassinated in 44 BCE. And Cleopatra, once again, found herself balancing on the edge of chaos. Enter Mark Antony. After Caesar's death, Rome split between his loyalists and his assassins. In the power struggle that followed, Cleopatra bet everything on one man, Mark Antony, Caesar's former ally. When he summoned her to Tarsus to answer for her loyalties, she arrived not as a supplicant, but as a spectacle. Her ship was gilded in gold, its sails scented with incense, and she herself reclined under a canopy dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. Antony, famously susceptible to charm, was instantly undone. The two became lovers, allies, and partners in rule, at least in theory. Antony gave her back lands that had long been lost to Egypt. Cleopatra gave him children, wealth, and the illusion of divine purpose. Together, they dreamed of a new empire, one ruled not from Rome, but from Alexandria. An Eastern empire that blended Greek, Egyptian, and Roman power. A dream that, naturally, made Rome nervous. The fall. Antony's rival in Rome, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, began a campaign of propaganda. He painted Cleopatra as a witch, a seductress who had bewitched a good Roman man and turned him against his people. She became, in the Roman imagination, the dangerous foreign queen who used her beauty to enslave heroes. When war came, it wasn't just Antony versus Octavian. It was Rome versus the image of Egypt, decadent, exotic, and doomed. The final battle came at Actium in 31 BCE. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was defeated. They fled back to Egypt, where their story ended, quietly, tragically. The death of the queen. When Octavian invaded Egypt, Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, fell on his sword. He was brought to her side, bleeding, and died in her arms. Cleopatra, knowing what awaited her, the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a captive, made her own choice. According to legend, she arranged for an asp, a venomous Egyptian snake, to be brought to her. She pressed it to her breast, and slipped away. Whether the story is true or not hardly matters. The image, the proud queen dying on her own terms, has endured for 2,000 years. When Octavian found her, she lay dressed in royal robes, her crown beside her, her attendants dead at her feet. Even in death, she was a symbol of defiance. The afterglow of a legend. Cleopatra's reign lasted just 21 years. But her story lasted forever. To some, she was a manipulative temptress. To others, a visionary queen who stood against the tide of empire. But beneath all the myth and marble, she was something simpler, a woman who refused to be erased. She ruled in a man's world, in an age that thought women were footnotes. And she turned her life into a story no one could stop telling. So, as the Nile drifts under moonlight and the reeds whisper against the water, imagine the last queen of Egypt watching from her palace balcony. The night is warm, the stars endless, and the world she built, fragile, beautiful, and doomed, glows softly in the dark. Cleopatra, the woman who made history her lover, and eternity her echo. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting through marble halls lit by trembling lamplight. The air smells faintly of wine, incense, and something else, unease. Because we're stepping into the palace of one of history's most infamous rulers. A man whose name has become shorthand for madness, cruelty, and unchecked power. Caligula. Or, to give him his full, slightly less intimidating name, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Which sounds like someone's entire family tree said at once. But history doesn't remember him as Gaius. It remembers him as Caligula, Little Boots. A nickname that started out cute, and ended in terror. The boy mascot of the legions. Caligula was born in 12 CE, into one of the most famous families in Roman history. His father, Germanicus, was a beloved general, the kind of man soldiers would follow anywhere. And when he took his family on military campaigns, he dressed his little son in a miniature soldier's outfit, boots and all. The troops adored the boy. They called him Caligula, their little boots, and he became a kind of mascot. Imagine a toddler toddling around a military camp, waving at hardened legionnaires who melted on the spot. But beneath the cuteness, Rome was already sliding toward darkness. His father, Germanicus, died young, probably poisoned. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, accused the Emperor Tiberius of murder. She was exiled and starved to death. Several of Caligula's brothers were executed. By the time he was a teenager, the boy who once made soldiers smile was the sole survivor of a family annihilated by politics. The Golden Heir. Tiberius, the reigning emperor, took Caligula in, not out of kindness, but convenience. He needed a controllable heir, and the traumatized young man seemed perfect. Caligula lived with Tiberius on the island of Capri, a place of luxury and whispers. Ancient writers describe Capri as a paradise of corruption, endless feasts, cruelty disguised as entertainment, and an emperor so paranoid he had servants thrown from cliffs on bad days. And Caligula learned from him. He learned how power worked, not through mercy or justice, but fear. He watched, listened, smiled, and survived. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, Caligula was 24. Rome, weary of gloom, erupted in celebration. Here was the grandson of heroes, the son of Germanicus. The city crowned him in flowers. People wept with joy in the streets. He was their golden boy, young, charming, beautiful, and, for the first few months, actually, good. He granted amnesty to political prisoners. He cut taxes. He gave lavish games and banquets. The Senate adored him. The people adored him. It was as if Rome had awakened from a nightmare. And then, something broke. The fever. Not long into his reign, Caligula fell violently ill. Some kind of fever, maybe malaria, maybe something worse. He hovered between life and death for weeks. When he recovered, the man who rose from that bed wasn't the same. The ancient sources describe it as a descent into madness. But it might have been more complicated than that. Imagine a man who'd spent his childhood surrounded by murder and betrayal, suddenly given absolute power, and a brush with death to remind him that even emperors are mortal. It was a dangerous mix. Caligula decided he wasn't just emperor anymore. He was divine. a living god in a city that still technically believed in gods. The god who lost his mind. He started small, ordering temples built in his honor. Then he moved on to dressing as Jupiter, Venus, even Apollo, depending on the mood. He'd walk into the Senate wearing gold robes and demand that senators kiss his feet. At one point, he declared that statues of the gods should have their heads removed and replaced with his own likeness. Because naturally, he thought he looked better than Zeus. He began referring to his sister, Drusilla, as a goddess too, and rumors swirled that their relationship was not strictly fraternal. When she died young, Caligula ordered public mourning across the empire. He didn't eat for days. Some said he tried to raise her from the dead. It was around then that the fear began to set in. The emperor's games. Caligula's reign turned into theater. Every day was a performance, and everyone else was a prop. He would summon senators to run beside his chariot for miles, just to watch them sweat. He'd host banquets where guests were made to eat gold leaf or sit beside live tigers. He declared wars that didn't exist, marching his army to the northern coast of Gaul, only to order them to collect seashells as spoils of war. Rome laughed nervously. Because no one dared laugh for real. He executed nobles on whims. He auctioned off the wives of senators for his amusement. He rebuilt parts of the imperial palace to connect directly to the temple of Jupiter, claiming it made them roommates. And, of course, there's the story of his horse. Incitatus. Caligula adored the animal so much he built it a marble stable, fed it oats mixed with gold dust, and gave it servants. He even announced plans to make it a consul, the highest office in Rome. Historians still debate whether he meant it seriously or as a joke at the Senate's expense. But in Caligula's Rome, the difference between mockery and decree didn't really exist anymore. The fear behind the madness. It's tempting to imagine Caligula as a cartoon villain, wild eyes, dripping with cruelty. But some accounts hint at something more tragic. He was paranoid, restless, and convinced that everyone wanted to kill him, which, in fairness, was true. He ordered constant executions. He slept little, ate erratically, and often spoke to the moon. He once told the Senate that if they truly loved him, they should stab themselves in devotion. No one volunteered. Behind the luxury and laughter, he was alone, a god no one believed in, surrounded by people too terrified to look him in the eye. The end of Little Boots. By 41 CE, his behavior had become unbearable even for Rome. The Praetorian Guard, his own bodyguards, began to plot. On a winter's day, as Caligula left a theater performance through a narrow corridor, a group of officers surrounded him. He was stabbed more than 30 times. Some say he didn't scream, he just stared, shocked that anyone would dare kill a god. When it was over, the guards dragged his body through the palace. His wife and daughter were murdered soon after. And Rome, once again, exhaled. The legend that wouldn't die. The Senate tried to erase his memory, to strike his name from monuments, melt his statues, and pretend he'd never existed. But you can't erase a story that vivid. Caligula became a symbol, not just of madness, but of what happens when power isolates you completely. Even now, his name lives on as shorthand for excess, cruelty, and divine delusion. A young man once adored as Little Boots, turned into the monster in Rome's marble mirror. So tonight, as the torches burn low and the marble corridors fade into shadow, imagine him, pacing through the halls of his palace, crown askew, muttering to invisible gods, and laughing softly at a world that dared to call him mortal. Because that was Caligula's real tragedy. He wanted to be a god, but never stopped being human enough to go mad trying.